The fluorescent hum of the Grandview atrium was a sound that didn't just sit in the air. It vibrated in the marrow of your teeth, a low-frequency drone that felt like a physical weight against the eardrums. Silas sat at the small, scuffed laminate desk in the security substation, watching the bank of 36 monitors. Most of them were static shots of empty corridors, the gated fronts of high-end boutiques, and the sprawling, shadowed food court. At 2 a.m., the mall wasn't just a building. It was a dormant organism, breathing through the ventilation shafts and creaking in its joints as the temperature dropped and the concrete settled. He had taken the job because it paid $3 more an hour than the warehouse, and because he'd been told he would be left to his own devices. Silas was a man who appreciated solitude, or so he thought. He liked the idea of being the sole king of a marble and glass empire, even if that empire only sold overpriced candles and designer sneakers. But the orientation had been off. The supervisor, a man named Miller, who looked like he hadn't slept since the mall opened in 1994, had handed him a laminated card. His hands had been shaking just enough to make the plastic click against the desk, a rhythmic, nervous sound that Silas hadn't understood at the time. "Read them," Miller had said, his voice a dry rasp, barely louder than the hum of the air conditioning. "Don't memorize them. Just follow them. There's a difference between knowing a rule and obeying it when the air starts to get cold." Silas pulled the card from his breast pocket now, the edges yellowed and peeling. He'd been on the job for 3 weeks, and so far the nights had been a slow crawl of silence and shadows. But tonight, the air felt thicker, like walking through chest-deep water. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt heavy, pressurized. He traced the text with a calloused thumb, the light from the monitors casting a sickly blue glow over the words. 1. The fountain in the north wing must remain off. If you hear water rushing, do not check the pipes. Turn up your radio volume and walk toward the south wing. 2. If you see a child in a red coat near the toy store, do not offer help. They are not lost. They are looking for something you do not want to find. 3. Between 3:15 a.m. and 3:45 a.m., the mirrors in the department store will reflect the room as it was in 1996. Do not attempt to enter the frame. 4. If you hear your own voice calling for help over the intercom, report to the security office and wait for the sun. Do not answer the call. 5. The janitor Arthur died in 2004. If you see him mopping the corridors, nod politely but do not step on the wet floor. The water is deeper than it looks. 6. Do not look at the mannequins, especially the ones in the eleganza window. If you accidentally make eye contact and they look back, run to the security office and lock the door. Do not look at the monitors until the scratching stops. 7. If the elevator opens and the interior is filled with black sand, press the close door button repeatedly. Do not let the sand touch your shoes. 8. The mall has 3 floors. If you find a staircase leading to a 4th, turn around and count to 100 before opening your eyes. Silas sighed, the sound echoing in the small room. He had spent the first week convinced this was an elaborate hazing ritual, a way to keep the graveyard shift guards from falling asleep at the console. He'd expected Miller to jump out from behind a plant, laughing at the new guy for taking the bait. But then there were the small things. The way the shadows in the food court seemed to detach themselves from the chairs and linger a second too long. The way the temperature would plummet 30 degrees in the span of a single hallway, leaving him shivering in his polyester uniform. He stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He grabbed his heavy maglite, its weight familiar and grounding. It was time for the first round. The mall felt different tonight. Wider, somehow. The corridors stretched out further than the blueprint suggested, the perspective warping in the dim emergency lighting. He stepped out of the office, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach do a slow, nauseating roll. He walked past the closed shutters of a shoe store, his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous space. Clack, hiss, the sound of rubber on polished marble. He kept his eyes strictly on the floor or the ceiling, avoiding the dark glass of the storefronts where his own reflection seemed to lag behind his movements. He reached the north wing. The fountain was a massive tiered marble structure, currently dry and silent, smelling faintly of old pennies and stagnant dust. Suddenly, a sound rippled through the air, a low, gurgling hiss. Silas froze, his hand tightening on the flashlight. It sounded like air being purged from a massive pipe, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a pump deep beneath the floorboards. Then came the splash. High, clear, and cold. He could hear the water cascading down the marble tiers, a sound that should have been peaceful but felt like a warning. He didn't look. He remembered Rule 1. He reached for his belt, fumbling with the dial on his heavy Motorola radio, and cranked the white noise up until the static filled his head like a physical wall, drowning out the splash of the water. He turned his back on the fountain and walked, his pace quickening toward the south wing. He didn't look back, even when he heard a wet, slapping sound on the marble behind him. The sound of bare feet running through puddles, chasing the sound of his own heartbeat. By the time he reached the transition corridor near the cinema, the static in his ears was a roar. He took a deep breath, turning the radio back down until the silence returned. But the silence wasn't the same as before. It was expectant. It was listening. He moved toward the center court, where the large department stores anchored the mall like heavy, sleeping beasts. This was the eleganza wing. He felt a bead of sweat slide down his temple, itching against his skin. He had always hated mannequins. Even in the daylight, their blank, molded faces and unnatural poses felt like a mockery of life. In the dim, emergency lighting of the mall, they were worse. They were silhouettes of people who weren't there, caught in a permanent state of frozen contemplation. He kept his gaze fixed on his own boots, counting the laces. Left, right, left, right. He could see the bottom of the eleganza display window in his peripheral vision. There were 4 of them in that window. Tall, slender figures draped in evening wear that shimmered like oil on water. He focused on the hem of a silk dress, noticing how it didn't seem to touch the floor. He looked away, his pulse spiking. Don't look at the mannequins. A soft thud vibrated through the floorboards. Silas stopped dead. It had come from inside the store. It sounded like something heavy and plastic falling over on a carpeted floor. He gripped his flashlight tighter, the metal cold against his palm. His instinct, honed by years of being a responsible worker, told him to investigate. That was what a security guard did. You check the perimeter. You secure the assets. But these rules weren't about assets. They were about survival. He began to walk again, but his curiosity, that traitorous human impulse, tugged at his neck. He caught a glimpse of the window. One of the mannequins, a male figure in a sharp tuxedo, was no longer standing in the center. It was leaned over, its stiff, articulated hand pressed against the glass. The fingers were spread wide, as if it were trying to feel the warmth of the hallway. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. He didn't look up at its face. He couldn't. He focused on the hand, the pale, seamless plastic of the fingers. They were vibrating, a high-frequency jitter that made the glass hum. He forced himself to move past. He reached the toy kingdom, where the colorful signs were now muted grays and blacks. He saw a flash of red out of the corner of his eye. A small figure was sitting on a bench near the shuttered entrance of the toy store. It was a child in a bright red peacoat, their hood pulled up so high their face was a cavern of shadow. They were swinging their legs back and forth, the heels of their shoes clicking against the metal base of the bench. The mall was locked. There were no children here. Silas remembered Rule 2. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" Or, "Where are your parents?" He stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the little holes in the acoustic foam, and walked past, his breath hitching in his chest. As he passed the bench, he heard a small, thin voice, like the sound of a reed flute. "It's not in here, Silas. It's under the floor. It's been waiting for someone with your eyes." He didn't stop. He didn't breathe until he was 50 yards away. How did it know his name? He checked his chest. His name tag was covered by his heavy-duty security jacket. The cold was beginning to seep through the fabric now, a chill that didn't come from the vents. He checked his watch. 3:20 a.m. The dead hour. He was near the Grand Hall of Mirrors, a decorative section of the mall filled with antique-style floor-to-ceiling glass meant to make the corridor look infinite. He remembered Rule 3. He tried to keep his eyes shut, navigating by the feel of the air and the memory of the floor. But the mall felt shifted. The distances were wrong. He tripped over a heavy, overflowing trash can that shouldn't have been there. His eyes snapped open in a reflex of panic. The mirrors weren't reflecting the dark, empty corridor. They were reflecting a version of the mall that was bright, vibrant, and terrifyingly alive. It was 1996. People in neon windbreakers and high-waisted jeans walked through the glass, their laughter a silent pantomime. A fountain was flowing in the reflection, its water sparkling under golden lights. A kiosk selling pretzels was steaming, the smell of salt and dough almost crossing the threshold of the glass. He saw a reflection of a younger version of Miller, the supervisor, laughing with a woman near the escalators. Miller looked happy. He looked human. Then, the reflection Miller turned and looked directly at Silas. His face went pale, his eyes widening until the whites showed all the way around. He began to scream, but no sound came through the glass. He lunged toward the surface of the mirror, his hands slamming against the silvered backing from the other side, his mouth moving frantically, forming the same words over and over. "Get out! Get out!" Silas backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned a corner and found himself back at the Eleganza wing. He had looped back, The mall wasn't a grid anymore. It was a knot. He was tired. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by a cold, numbing dread that felt like lead in his veins. He just wanted to get back to the office, to the safety of the monitors and the heavy door. He reached the service elevator. He pressed the button, the copper contact clicking. The door slid open with a heavy, metallic groan. Silas looked down. A thick, obsidian-black sand was pouring out of the elevator car like a slow-motion waterfall. It didn't behave like normal sand. It seemed to writhe, the grains shifting against one another with a faint, metallic clicking sound, like thousands of tiny insects rubbing their legs together. Rule 7. He slammed his hand against the close door button. The sand reached the threshold, a single black grain tumbling onto the tip of his boot. He kicked his foot back frantically, the grain feeling like a hot coal through the leather. The doors hissed shut just as the pile was about to spill into the hallway and swallow his feet. He stood there, panting, the silence of the mall pressing in on him. He needed to get back. He turned to take the stairs, the emergency exit glowing with a dim, sickly green light. He found them. A wide, carpeted staircase he'd never seen before, rising up into a darkness that felt solid. The mall only had 3 floors. This staircase went higher. The signage on the wall next to the stairs was written in a language that looked like English but hurt his eyes to read. The letters seemed to be vibrating, shifting into shapes that suggested teeth, claws, and open eyes. Rule 8. Silas turned his back to the stairs, his heart a frantic bird in a cage. He squeezed his eyes shut until he saw spots. 1, 2, 3. His voice sounded small and brittle in the cavernous space. 21, 22. He heard something coming down the stairs. It wasn't the sound of feet. It was the sound of something heavy and wet being dragged, the squelching, rhythmic sound of a mop being pulled across stone. 35, 36. Late tonight, aren't you, Silas? The floors are so very thirsty. A wet, gurgling voice asked. It sounded like someone talking through a mouthful of silt. He didn't open his eyes. Rule 5. He didn't step on the floor where he felt the cold moisture spreading. He felt a splash of cold liquid hit his ankle, soaking into his sock. It felt thick, like syrup. He kept counting, his voice a whisper. 98, 99, 100. He opened his eyes. The staircase was gone. In its place was the familiar drab hallway leading back to the central hub. He began to run, his boots skidding on the marble. He was almost there. He could see the glass door of the security substation. But to get there, he had to pass the Eleganza window one last time. It was unavoidable. The mall had funneled him here. He kept his head down, his chin tucked into his chest. He focused on the white line painted on the floor for the cleaning robots. He was 10 feet away. 5 feet. A sound stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't a monster's growl or a ghost's wail. It was the sound of his own voice, coming from the mall's intercom system, distorted by the old speakers. "Help! Someone help me! I'm in the basement. The water is rising. Miller, Silas, is anyone there? Please." It was his voice. The exact cadence, the exact tremor of fear he felt in his own throat. It sounded so real he almost turned toward the basement door. Rule 4. He gripped his flashlight so hard the plastic groaned. He didn't answer. He didn't move toward the basement stairs. But in that moment of distraction, as he fought the urge to rescue himself, his gaze drifted. Just an inch. Just enough to break the boundary of the rule. He saw the mannequin. It wasn't the tuxedo one this time. It was the female figure in the crimson evening dress. It wasn't looking at the display or the empty store. It had pressed its face flush against the glass. Its eyes weren't painted on plastic. They were wet. They were a piercing, frantic blue. They were wide with a predatory, starving intelligence. And they were looking directly into his. The mannequin's jaw dropped open, not in a mechanical hinge, but by tearing through the molded plastic of its face, revealing a hollow black gullet that seemed to go on forever. It slammed its palms against the glass. Crack. A spiderweb of fractures bloomed across the display window. Silas didn't wait for the second strike. He bolted. He heard the glass shatter behind him, a sound like a frozen lake breaking apart. Then came the sound of plastic feet hitting the marble. Click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. It was fast. It was rhythmic. It was getting closer. He reached the security office, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped his keys. He fumbled with the lock, the click-clack growing louder, echoing off the high ceilings. He felt a cold draft on the back of his neck, smelling of old fabric and ozone. He threw himself inside and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt and the secondary latch. Thud. Something hit the door with the force of a battering ram. The heavy steel groaned in its frame. Silas backed away, falling into his chair, the monitors flickering around him. He remembered the end of Rule 6. Do not look at the monitors until the scratching stops. He squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears, but he could still hear it. The sound of plastic fingernails, long, hard, and sharp, dragging across the steel of the door. Scree, scree. It was the sound of something that had all the time in the world. He sat there in the dark, the only light coming from the glowing screens he wasn't allowed to see. He felt the vibration of the scratching through the floor, through the desk, through his own bones. Hours passed. Or maybe it was minutes. Time had no meaning in the substation. Sometimes he heard voices. His mother's voice calling him for dinner. Miller's voice telling him he was doing a great job. The voice of the child in the red coat whispering through the keyhole. He didn't move. He didn't open his eyes until the scratching finally, mercifully, faded into the hum of the building. Slowly, the air in the room, which had turned freezing, began to warm. Silas opened his eyes. He looked at the monitors. The mall was empty. The Eleganza window was a jagged hole of broken glass, but there was no plastic figure in sight. The black sand was gone. The fountain was dry. He checked the time. 6 a.m. The sun was beginning to bleed through the skylights far above. He heard the heavy sound of the main mall doors being unlocked by the morning cleaning crew. Silas stood up. He took the laminated card from his pocket, laid it on the desk, and placed his badge on top of it. He didn't care about the pay. He didn't care about the reference. He walked out of the office, through the lobby, and out into the crisp, real morning air. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror. For a split second, he saw a figure standing on the roof of the mall, silhouetted against the rising sun. A tall, slender figure in a red dress, waving a stiff plastic hand in a slow, mocking goodbye.